door, that we will put to naught the scoffer and the gainsayer, the humanist and the secularist and all the antichrist of this particular hour, because the demonstration of God has no equal. Exactly what do you do with an empty wheelchair? What do you do with a pile of crutches? What do you do with a handful of hearing aids? You don't do anything with them. There is no way to fight results. You may not like me. You may not like my message. You may not like my theology. They didn't like Jesus. They didn't like his theology. But they could not fight the results. What do you do with an empty tomb? What do you do with a funeral procession that turns into a praise service and comes leaping and running and shouting with victory and joy back through the city gates because the son of a widow has been raised from the dead by the sound of a man called Jesus, his voice? What do? You don't do anything with it. How do you fight a man that doesn't even bother to knock at the door? He just simply comes through the wall, sits down at your table and says, I'm going to have lunch with you. How do you fight a man who stands in front of a tomb and says, Lazarus, come forth? And he that was dead suddenly comes stumbling out of the entrance of the tomb. You don't fight it. There is no way that you can fight it. This is why I am saying that as ministers, as laity, as workers, as saints of God, as believers, we need to have these signs following, because there is no way to fight it. There is no way to fight it. They could reason away Jesus' philosophy. They could reason away his theology. They could argue people out of it. But what do you do with the ex-leper who is now healed, whose flesh is white as newborn baby skin? What do you do? What do you do with an ex-cripple who has never walked? What do you do with the man who says, whether he be of God or no, I know not. One thing I do know, whereas I was blind, now I see. There is nothing that you can do against it. And the church needs to take its rightful position and come to its feet. These glorious exploits for the cause of Jesus and his kingdom. I'd like to say at this point that at first, when I began to be used in the realm of the gift of faith, and when healings began to take place and all these miracles began to happen, just while I was preaching, it has come to the point where I can preach about almost anything I want to, and still there will be miracles and healings in the audience among the people. For example, I was in a service in Brother Kilgore's church in January of this year. One night, faith was so strong in that service. A woman who was a non-believer, a non-Pentecostal, she had brought her baby. The soft spot in the baby's head was not healing, and there was a lump that had raised an inch high on the top of this baby's head. And faith was so high that this non-Pentecostal suddenly grasped it. She suddenly believed it. Jesus meant people like that. When the Jews should have believed it, they didn't. But it was the Gentiles who suddenly grasped it. It was the Roman soldier who suddenly grasped it. And Jesus rebuked and admonished the so-called believers of that day, because those who knew nothing about the truth were suddenly getting it. We saw this happen. This non-Pentecostal jumped to her feet, raised her baby in her hands above her head, and cried, Jesus. And when she did, God instantaneously healed that baby. Instantaneously healed that baby's head. I ran down the aisle when they told me this had happened and got to this young mother, and she was just trembling and weeping and crying. And as I remember, she received the baptism of the Holy Ghost. But I took that baby in my own arms, and I stroked that baby's head and ran my fingers over that baby's head. It was totally healed by the power of God. The tomb is empty, folks, and Jesus is alive, and he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He has never changed. What he did then, he can do now, and he is doing it now. People have been healed of heart disease. People have been healed of cancer. God has replaced kneecaps. He has replaced bones in people's bodies. Not only can he restore, but he also can recreate. And there are innumerable examples I could give tonight in this session for you to view, for you to hear. Not something that happened 2,000 years ago, but something that happened this year, this week, last night. things are happening among us in this hour that are causing the Holy Scriptures to come alive in our presence, in our midst. God bless this wonderful day of the outpouring of the Spirit in this latter time. Thank God for the building of the latter house and for the outpouring of the latter rain, according to Jewish traditions and because of the land of the Bible and its customs and what the Bible has given us through these particular parallels and these particular parables. We understand that the latter rain will be 7 times greater than the former rain or the early rain. That means instead of 3,000 people receiving the Holy Ghost in one day, as it did in the early rain of Pentecost, we can expect something 7 times greater than that to take place in our present generation and hour. If this indeed be the time of the latter rain, and we understand and know from Bible prophecy that it is, we could expect 21,000 in one day to receive the baptism of the Holy Ghost. Thousands are beginning to receive the Holy Ghost in our services, especially on foreign soil. Thousands, hundreds in one service. In 2 or 3 days, 3 or 4 or 5,000 people are beginning to receive the baptism of the Holy Ghost. We ought to come to our feet in every service with great shouting, with great worship, with great praise, and thank God for the ushering in of this hour of might and this hour of miracles. But as I was saying, when I first entered into this realm, it was confusing. I became frustrated because so many things happened almost totally inconspicuously. Some of the greatest miracles that happened in services where I was preaching, some of the most notable miracles, I did not find out until the next day or the next week. People would leave the services and discover that the tumor was gone. They would go back to a doctor a month later and the cancer had vanished. The surgery was canceled. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters have come in declaring that surgeries have been canceled, doctors have been canceled, all kinds of things have been canceled because of that individual or those individuals exposing themselves to the presence and the power and the might and the miraculous ability of the Holy Ghost to heal, to perform miracles, and to deliver. This we must have. We will perish as a people without it. We will perish as a nation, so to speak. We will perish as a church. We will perish without the demonstration of the Spirit of God and power. In one service where I was, there was over 7,000 people in this women's conference. There was a woman in the balcony. She had had surgery on her knee some 3 or 4 times. The kneecap had been removed, and the doctors now had prognosed that the leg would have to be removed from the knee down. Standing in that balcony straight back from the platform where I was preaching among all these hundreds and thousands of people, she raised her hands, and the gift of faith moved into that congregation. Not only was she healed, but many were healed. But this woman suddenly began to kick her leg. She began to kick her knee. Her knee began to bend, and the kneecap was replaced by the power of God in that service. You know, when I found out about it, I found out about it 6 months later in another state, in another conference. As I approached the auditorium where I was preaching and this conference was being held, I saw this lovely lady on the arm of her husband walking across the lawn, coming down the sidewalk, and she cried out my name. She said, "Brother Stoneking, Brother Stoneking." And I went over to her, and she began to tell me the story. She had high heels on. She bent her leg. She kicked her foot, and the joy of God was on her face, because I'm telling you, no matter what the doctors say, no matter what the prognosis is, no matter what the diagnosis is, when all hope is gone and the hand of man has reached its limitation and there is no more hope, there is a voice that says, "Try me." Every miracle begins with an impossibility. Every miracle begins with an impossibility. And what the doctors could not do, there still is a Nazarene, there still is a man from Galilee whose name is Jesus that can walk on the scene. Do you understand me tonight when I say there are many people alive among us that were prognosed and diagnosed to be dead 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but because of this man who said, I am the resurrection and the life.